Hello, welcome. My name is Christy Harrigan. I am a Principal Sales Engineer at MarkLogic, and I'm going to talk to you today about the General Data Protection Regulation. Does anyone here not know what the General Data Protection? Oh, we have one. Okay, good. Are you based in Europe or are you?
New Zealand.
New Zealand.
My boss explained it this morning, so I don't know whether that counts.
Okay, all right. That's okay. I mean, I have a quick overview slide, but I'm guessing most people here know the General Data Protection Regulation. Has anyone started a General Data Protection Regulation initiative? One-ish, two-ish. Okay, yeah. This is what we're hearing, that a lot of people are thinking about it. Perhaps they've gone some far, but there's quite a lot of ground to cover. So, all right. What is the regulation? I'm sure for all but one of you, you know this. It's a regulation that comes into effect in May next year. It affects any organisation, doesn't have to be European, that deals with stores or processes personal data of European citizens. And failure to comply can result in 4% fines of global revenue. Now, for most people, that's bankruptcy. So I think we all know this. We all know that this is a serious regulation that we need to be thinking about, but we also probably know that it's rather tricky. So this is, imagine, from the sense I've got, where most of us are, but head in the sand, right? You know, that's another year away yet, and it's too hard, it's too complicated. Is that kind of true? I mean, you know, when people aren't looking at it, is it because it's, what is it? Is it too complicated, or, you know, feel like you've got another year away, or both? Yeah, okay. All right, fine. So just a quick overcap, high-level view to sort of set the context of the talk. The regulation is obviously specifically talking about EU citizens and their personal data. It grants a set of new rights for the citizens, and consequently a new set of responsibilities for the organisations who store or process their data. And for sure, there is a very large contractual. Hello? Oh, that's a bit dire. There's a bit of there's a contractual component to this. So, for example, you know, the difference between a data controller and a data processor. So I can be a data controller, so I might be an insurer. I as an individual will go to an insurer and say, I want a new policy. They're the person with whom I do a contract. They are the data controller. They might then, for example, reference to a credit check agency. They would be a data processor. And if that credit check agency goes and uses my data in a non-consensual fashion, I won't sue them. I will sue the insurance company. So for this reason, a lot of effort has gone into the legal analysis of the regulation. What does it mean? Where do we need to renegotiate contracts and so forth? But actually, there's a much bigger component here, which is, or I would suggest, a perhaps even more trickier component, which is the data aspect to it. So the first thing we have to drill into is personal data. What is it? Personal data, as defined by the regulation, is anything that can identify a living EU citizen. I'm being a bit loose with my language, and I know we have some experts in here who might pull me up in my language, but roughly speaking, anything that can identify a living EU citizen. I mean, that's quite a lot. Now, I'm sure you've all been to a lot of MarkLogic talks. You'd all have heard about the benefits of bringing data together from silos. Perhaps some of you will have already engaged in this kind of exercises via a data lake and so on. And what's important when we think about this is that when we aggregate data, that aggregated data set can become personal data, whereas perhaps it wasn't individually. Let me give you an example. Go back to the insurance example. So I will have a policy number, and that is personal data because it can identify me. It is unique. But that policy number might be stored in a relational system by some, you know, there might be a line which says, you know, Christy Harrigan signed up on the 21st of whatever, her policy number is X ABC, and that might have unique identifier, a primary key in a relational system. Now that primary key by itself is just a number. In the context of that row there, it is personal data. But if I use that as a foreign key in another table, and that foreign key, I don't know, perhaps just talks about the policy type, over here, that number and that policy type isn't personal data. If I just took that personal data, or that data on its own, you can't figure out who it is. But when you bring the two tables together, I feel like I've got some sibilance feedback. When you bring those two tables together, you can start to hook them together and it becomes personal data. It's a trivial example, but you can realize, hopefully, that when you start to bring together a lot of disparate data sets, a lot of data potentially becomes personal data. And the other thing, really, is that this isn't just about a legal concern. This isn't just about delegating responsibility, legally speaking, with our third parties and so forth. There's an operational component to it. And this is really the heart of what we're going to talk about today, the challenges of how do I do a data export? You know, if I, as a citizen, can say, I want a complete data export, machine-readable data export, all of my personal data, and we've just realized that that personal data, the definition of it is quite broad, that can become a challenge. Now, again, there's a lot of refinement in the regulation in terms of our understanding. There's a lot of provisions, legal overwritings, and so forth. And so, for sure, there's a certain amount of clarity that is yet to emerge, but there's a core challenge here, which is absolutely crucial and isn't going to change, which is you have data everywhere. Because it sits in silos, you probably don't have full control over it. And so, if I say, give me an export of my data, and you go, no worries, I have a poor intern sat over here, a lowly paid intern, who will then go to every single system and figure out what that data relates to me, give a version and then export it, and we're happy. Trouble is, I'm a disgruntled ex-customer, and I don't like you very much, and me and 50 of my buddies who are also disgruntled decide to have a coordinated effort. We all phone up at the same time and say, we want an export of our data, and by the way, we want it within the timeframes given. Suddenly now, it's a risk, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen, because we've all got happy customers. But it's a risk. It illustrates the challenge that there's a scalability issue with achieving the operational realities of this compliance. So let's drill down a little bit more to become a little bit more concrete. So when we talk about personal data, we talk about the fact that there is many different types of data. So we know the structured data sets, right? You know, the oracles, the SQL servers, the relational databases. We know we've got unstructured data, legal documents, call transcripts, right? I mean, these are all potentially personal data. I'm talking about myself, and I'm giving you details about myself, and you've possibly transcribed that, and you've stored that in a file somewhere, and that might be in a file share. It might be in an ECM system. You might have moved all of that into Hadoop data lake because you want to start doing sentiment analysis. Okay, I mean, you know, how many has bought a data lake and put data in it kind of willy-nilly? Oh, one person, okay, yeah. A couple of people. So I think, you know, anyone who's bought a data lake has probably gone, oh, hey, we just chuck our data and we can do an analysis on it. But here's the trouble. We have to have security by design. Right, so one of the components, one of the reasons this regulation came into effect is to say there's been a lot of high-profile cases in the news over the last decade, couple of decades, whatever, more so, of data breaches. You know, of people leaving data on a laptop or disgruntled administrators taking copies of that data. And so, of course, this is one of the things that the security by design is hoping to tackle. It says it is not good enough anymore to have that personal sensitive information about me on a shared drive somewhere, just to copy it willy-nilly into a data lake. You have to secure it. You have to make sure that only the people can access it who are authorized to do so. And what is that authorization wrapped up inside? It's wrapped up inside consent. Okay, so when I give you my personal data, I do so with consent. It says, this is the reason I'm giving you my data. This is what you're allowed to use it for, and this is the time frame over which this consent is granted. Now, again, there might be legal precedents and overrides that muddy the waters, but again, if you use my data or you share that data with a third party or you hand it to an analyst who then takes that data and runs off with it and links it to the newspaper, that is a 4% fine potentially scenario. Right? Those are the kinds of scenarios that are likely to lead you to the 4% fine if it was shown that there was gross negligence involved in the organisation. So there's security, there's access and control. I spoke about the fact that you need to be able to respond to these requests in a timely fashion, the ability to, if you are going to want to put this data into a data lake to do some kind of analysis, you need to redact that information, you need to actually remove the personal components of that data so that you can still do sensible, valid analytics on it. And then, as I said, this idea of consent, which is really the kind of bow that ties it all together. So there are a number of challenges to achieving compliance. Yeah, feel free to take a picture, or I believe these slides will be available afterwards. I'm not going to go through this in great detail because there's a lot to cover here, and I'm sure some of this will resonate heavily. I want to draw out a few key points. So most people in this room haven't started or have only tentatively started, and the kind of feeling I got was, well, it's just too big, it's just too complicated, I don't even know where to start. So the first question you probably want to ask yourself is, well, where do I have the biggest risks? I mean, I don't want to go and invest effort in a time where, you know, perhaps there's already got decent security, or the amount of personal data is limited in its sensitivity. I want to make sure that I'm going to have a sensible bang for my buck when I do actually invest in overhauling my systems. Here's a really interesting one. Someone posed this, so this isn't my phrase, sadly. How do I remember that I'm supposed to forget you, right? This ability to data erasure, the right to be forgotten. It's not technically GDPR, but it's all tied up in the same thing. How am I supposed to remember who I'm supposed to forget? If I'm supposed to delete all of their personal data, how am I supposed to remember that I've forgotten them? Because surely that information is personal data. An interesting little one to get your head around. And then how do I maintain compliance over point? The point here is that we all live in a changing world. We all live in a world where data is constantly changing, systems are constantly changing, mergers and acquisitions are a fact of life. And if I go and I think, okay, well, here are my systems, and this is the type of data I've got, and this is how it all links together, and I'm going to go for a data mapping exercise, and I'm going to bring in Ernst & Young or KPMG or whoever. I'm not endorsed by any of these people, by the way, so I just mentioned them randomly. And they're going to come in, they're going to do a data mapping exercise, and they say, we've got the data here, and this is how it all relates, and this is what it's used for. That's a static piece of information. It doesn't change. It doesn't grow and change with the business. It doesn't help you address the operational component. Right? It just tells you where you've got data, but it doesn't also stay current with the system. So what do you need to put in place to maintain compliance over time? So the first thing that we've looked at when we analysed this problem was a very high-level roadmap. So it's just a roadmap, it's just very high level, and it's just a suggestion on the kind of steps that you need to go through in order to walk towards compliance. So the very first thing you need to do is identify and analysis of personal data. So some of it is just going to be very manual effort. You know, it's the management consultants coming in, or if you want, or sitting down with your own SMEs and actually documenting where you think you have personal data. What is the nature of this personal data? Do we have consent for it? You know, how does it relate? What are the data flows through the system? So this is a sort of the documentation component to it. So you've got to go through that exercise and understand your estate and the data and where it sits. The second thing then is, once you've understood that and you've said, okay, well, we have a nicely secured system over here, it's got encryption on disk, it's got nicely controlled access controls, or over here we have legal precedent that says actually we're okay, you know, the data's okay, we can use it in the people who can access this data are okay to do so, we've got that signed off by the lawyers, we don't need to worry about that. Over here though, I've got a shared drive. And I've got legal documents in there. And those legal documents are probably personal data. Or I've got a data lake and I dumped a whole load of data in. and anyone can access it. Or I've got a access database, and there's information in that, and is access really that secure? I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But this idea of then starting to drill in, have like a hotspot analysis. Where is it that I need to focus my effort? Where should I put my hard-earned pounds, dollars, euros, yen, whatever. The next step then is an ongoing kind of management of this, which is maintaining control of personal data. So what this is starting to drive towards is the fact that for sure there is a manual component to going out and documenting the systems and the data that they have. But actually, what we would like to move towards is a system where, as part of BAU business change, we'd like to document where we've pulled a new system in, and then it's going to contain personal data. So I've gone out and I've got 1,000 systems and I've got all this personal data, and then I want to build a new application, or I want to consolidate some of those systems, or I want to whatever. Rather than, there's a change control, there's a process to doing this, right? We all have rigor, governance around putting changes into the business. We ought to make personal data and the analysis of that part of that change control. And we again ought to have a place where we can record this and understand its context against the previous systems that we have, how they relate. Has this suddenly introduced a security risk? Has this suddenly introduced a flow of personal data that puts the organization, or my customers, or my employees at risk? Where necessary, we may also find that we've got personal data in systems where they aren't sufficiently secure. So we might need to anonymize that system. Again, the data lake, an analytical system, or data warehouse, and we've pushed data across, and we want to do some kind of demographic analysis or market analysis or whatever it is. We don't have the consent from the individuals to say, yeah, you can use my name, address, and everything else to do this analysis. But you might want to, use if you can use my anonymized purchase history or something like that. So the ability to go through the systems and figure out where we need to actually anonymize or remove the personal data. We may need to move that data off less secure systems onto more secure systems. So for example, one of the provisions in the regulation says that if you encrypt the data on disk, and you have a data breach, a rogue administrator comes along and steals that data file, assuming that you have done the encryption at a sufficiently high enough level of encryption, you aren't obligated to inform the regulator of a data breach. So actually, by encrypting your data, you've massively reduced the risk of that data. It's a very important way of dealing with this security by design. That's one side of things, and the other side of things is, well, I've got this data and I've got people who can access it who can't access it, who shouldn't be able to access it, so maybe I need to tighten the access controls. Or maybe I need to use a different database that has better access and security systems. I wonder if anyone uses such a database. Then we've got the sort of operational side of things, the compliance, the ongoing compliance of the regulation. So honouring consent. So I can phone up and I can say, I withdraw consent to receive direct marketing. I might have gone to the website, I might have ticked the tick box that says, yeah, sure, send me messages. And then I find that actually I don't want the messages anymore. I don't want the messages. I don't want new stuff, telling me about new offers. So I now have the right to say, please, take me off your mailing list. So you have to make sure that you remove that personal data from the various systems. So if you're going to start to think about what that means, you have to understand who I am, you have to understand where my data sits, you have to understand what data is related to this request that I'm talking about, who are the system owners, are there some business processes involved in deleting that data or restricting that data. Okay. So there's definitely a component to this. We'll drill into this in more detail. But here's the kicker. One of the reasons why the regulation is simply not being addressed at the moment, and trust me, I mean, if I had a room 10 times this size, I think the proportionality of who started at it versus who hasn't would be roughly the same. The reason being is because who wants to invest God knows how many hundreds of thousands, millions, depending on the size of your organization, into a regulation that's going to provide you, what, no business value? I have to delete some data from my marketing database. Well, I don't want to do that. What value is that to me? It's just effort, it's just cost. Well, maybe I won't even get fined. I feel quite comfortable on this. The cost of achieving compliance is just too expensive, right? It's just too expensive. Probably less than the fines themselves. If someone fines me, I'll bring in the big gun lawyers at that point. Right? So that's maybe why we might not address it. Actually, when you think about what you're achieving with compliance, we'll see, at least with the proposal or the approach that we're proposing, is you end up with a 360-degree view of personal data. Right, so if I go back to the example of I phone up and say, please give me an export of my data, you need to know where my personal data is. Right? You need to have a complete view of me. Not just, I have data over here, but my data, me. You know about me and where my data sits, who it's being used for, who it's being shared for, and why. That sounds like a lot of value to me. That sounds like a 360-degree view. That sounds like something that I can actually turn to my advantage. Perhaps I've got an MDM project or a customer journey project or something like this that I've been putting off because, again, it's too difficult, it's too expensive. Perhaps we tried it before with a relational technology. Perhaps it didn't work out so well. And if we can roll the two exercises up into one, if we make it a compliance as well as a business value exercise, maybe that changes the equations of the economics. Just a thought. So, the proposal is that you put in what we're calling a consent management hub or personal data hub that allows us to view, manage, and control the personal data, not necessarily the actual data itself. Right? We're not suggesting that you decommission all of your systems and move it into MarkLogic. Well, maybe we are, but we recognize that that's not going to happen. But it's important to know where that data is, who it sits, what it's being used for, and so forth. So let's look at the very high-level solution. So just replaying everything I've said so far, but in a slightly different spin. So the very first thing that MarkLogic can do to help you along this journey, remember the first thing I said was identify personal data. So some of that will just be, I've got existing documentation, I've got SMEs, subject matter experts, who know where personal data is. But if I've got a bunch of documents that have sat in a file share somewhere, do I really want to hire someone to go through, hire an Ernst & Young to go through, God knows how much an hour, and tell me, yes, there's personal data in there? Is there a smarter approach? Could we use a technology that indexes everything on ingest and can apply some smart rules against that data that says, that looks like a name to me, that looks like an address to me. If you tell me what a policy number, the format of a policy number, that looks like a policy number to me. So because MarkLogic can ingest more or less any kind of data, and it can look at it and it can apply advanced rules against it, we can actually help you identify where you've got personal data. Now, we're not saying that you then have to leave the data in MarkLogic. You can use MarkLogic as an advanced engine to potentially pick out data and then later delete it if necessary. That would be the first step. The second step then is to say, okay, so I've got the system over here, either because I use MarkLogic to help me identify or because I know that I have names and addresses and whatever in this system. I can then start to say, okay, so I've got system X. It has this type of data in. The system owner is Joe Bloggs. And this system is used by underwriting. Well, that's okay. I've got a legal reason why I'm allowed to store this data. That's good. I can start to say, yes, this system has a legal reason. Well, this system over here is customer data, and on my website, I've got a legally approved message saying, this is what you agree to, the T's and C's and all that good stuff. Okay, that's good. That's fine. I can tick this off the box. This system over here, we've had a look at it. We found this personal data, and there's no discernible consent against that system. That's not to say that we don't have consent, but we haven't identified that consent. We can't legally, if a regulator comes and says, prove to me that you've got compliance, I can't do that. I don't have the supporting evidence for this system to inform a regulator, or indeed myself, whether I have consent or not. So this is starting to drive towards this ability to do risk analysis. Where do I need to invest extra time? Where do I need to invest extra investigations? Maybe I need to go out to my community, understand if I do or don't have consent, and if I don't have consent, what do I need to do to change the situation? So provenance and lineage as well is built into that, because you have to know where the data comes from, and as well perhaps how the data moves through the system. So for example, I've got a system over here. I've typed in my details. I've said, no, I don't want direct marketing. Please, I want direct marketing. But you have a data flow that moves into direct marketing anyway, because, hey, by default, the assumption was we're going to market to everyone. So the data flow is just as important as well, understanding that data flows from A to B. So again, that's not necessarily to say that all data flowing out isn't consensual, but perhaps it's an area where we might need to do some further investigation to make sure if we need to put some extra constraints in place to stop the flow of data. And then this idea of policies, this idea of saying, well, okay, if I've got medical records, I'm a medical underwriter, for example, that's really sensitive. Like, that cannot be viewed by anyone other than a very specific set of individuals. So if you find this data flowing out anywhere, the policy is just remove it altogether. On the other hand, over here, I've got an email address, and I might be able to, or I don't know, let's say, an email address, and I want to use that perhaps in some downstream analytics, and so I want to anonymize it, but I want it to make it look like an email address. I want to make sure that the downstream analyst knows that it's an email address, and perhaps I do some kind of clever trick where every time we see christy.harrigan@marklogic.com, it always gets anonymized to the same version. So the statistics of the data don't change. It just means that it's no longer personal. So we can have different levels of policies depending on the different types of data. So this is all about documenting that data and pulling it in. And because it lives in a database and not in an Excel spreadsheet, it's a living document, right? It's something that you can keep current, and it's something that you can query. We'll see that in a second. The next step then is to zoom in on individuals. So again, if you think about the problem of me saying, give me an export of my data, you need to know what my data is. This is a data matching problem. I highly suggest that you come to my MDM talk later on in the day, and we'll talk about how MarkLogic can help with data matching. But suffice it to say that we have got some pretty clever techniques that we've deployed, for example, in the police forces to help catch undesirables. Perhaps you've gone by aliases and all sorts of things. So we can again be an engine that can actually help you pull together different data sets and say, well, over here I found this email address associated to this policy number, and over here I found a legal document with this email address in. Right, so I'm going to make the inference that this document therefore relates to this policy number. Okay. Again, we're not saying you have to leave the data in MarkLogic, but you can use this as a sort of pre-processing step, as an upfront step to start to unpick your data, figure out where you've got personal data and how it relates to each other. On the other hand, there are some cases where you might want to leave data in MarkLogic. So I've just jumped ahead of myself. That's very unprofessional. Before I get on to why you might want to leave data inside MarkLogic, I just want to drill in a little bit around this idea of a consent entity. So we're sort of developing this idea of a consent management hub. So this is all about saying, putting in consent information, so not necessarily the personal data itself, but all this metadata about personal data and what I'm allowed to use it for, who's using it, and why. And there's this kind of, hopefully some of you will have had this concept of entities before in different talks, but if not, it's this idea that you can have a single document that pulls together different disparate data set, different data points about individual things. So in my case, the entity is me, right? So we're not putting my personal data in there. We might have some identifier, perhaps a policy number that we agree is okay to be used to represent me, or again, perhaps we come up with some distinct identifier that isn't used anywhere else but this system. I'll explain why that's important in a second. I'll come back to that. But what we really want to store is this identifier, any supporting documentation that tells us that we're allowed to use that data for a particular purpose. So this might be a HTML scrape of the wording that was used on the website. Because here's an interesting challenge. I went to your website, I typed in my details, and the T's and C's and the wording was X. And then at some point later, someone's changed the wording because a lawyer came along and said, that's not good enough. So when you now go back and say, well, yes, just fine, you tick the tick box on the website, what did I tick the tick box to? Right, so you need to actually store the documentation itself along with the entity to know what it is that I signed up to. And time is an important component to this. When I did it is very important to all of this. So purpose, time, documentation. Where can you find my data? Where is that data going into? Where is it flowing to? Where is it being shared? And who is the data owner? Because ultimately, when you have to come to answer the question of, can you give me an export of my data or can you delete my data? The chances are we're not going to be able to automate that for you, right? We're not going to be able to go into your system and delete all the records and make sure we keep reference integrity and all of the hard things. And anyway, find me an IT owner who's just going to go and allow some consent, application to have, unfettered access to their data. Ain't gonna happen. So it's important to know who we need to talk to in the organization to actually perform the specifics of the operational side of deleting the data or restricting access and so forth. So that's at a very high level, this idea of a consent entity, and it's kind of the heart of what we're storing inside this consent management hub. So one of the nice things in MarkLogic 9 is that we've doubled down on security. I'm sure you'll have heard this a few times. We've got on-disk encryption, which, as I said earlier, is a very important tool in your battle against the hackers and the nefarious administrators. We've got advanced redaction and anonymization that allows you to change the values to something that is no longer personal, but without changing the statistics of the data, like I mentioned earlier with changing the email to something else, but consistently so. And this idea of element-level security. So where you do put the data into MarkLogic because it was stored in an insufficiently secure system, we can now, per user, based on the policy information that we have, filter out what data they can have available to them. So it can be quite a nice place to actually replace your existing less secure systems with a MarkLogic system. As well, just something I forgot to mention slightly earlier in the talk as well is that this documentation can come from logs. So something we've been talking to from customers is putting in access logs from various systems. So you can use this either as a retrospective analysis, mostly as a retrospective analysis or as this upfront analysis to say, okay, I have the system, I have the access logs, this user asked for this query at this time, and I can actually go back in time and say, against the consent I have, was that a valid access? Now, you can't go back and change the history, but what you can do is you can say we have a repeated pattern of unauthorized people in the context of consent, accessing that data. What I need to do is I need to go and embark on a program that says I need to inform my users, better educate them, I need to put better security controls in place, whatever it means. So there's multiple ways you can get this information. And then finally, there's a hub, it's an operational hub, right? So we can actually put interfaces around this that allows you to query this data. It's living documentation. So remember I said how you need to be changing your change processes. So every time you make a change, you think about the regulation and personal data. Well, why not have a nice interface that allows you to actually update that documentation as you go through a change process? What about having an interface that says, am I allowed to use this data? I want to access this data. I want to get a copy of this person's email address so I can do a marketing job. Am I allowed to do so? right? So we can actually use all this information to help us to make sure that we achieve and maintain compliance, as well as then actually being able to start to pull together snippets of information that I can then use to respond to regulatory queries themselves. So if I say, give me an export of my data, I can then have whoever inside the organization is responsible for dealing with that request ask, tell me all the business owners or the system owners or the systems that has Christie's data, tell me who those system owners are, and give me a list so I can then go out and start conversations with them and say, you need to go delete this person with this policy number. Okay, so it's an operational component that's going to help you actually respond to these things. And because you aren't having to do the analysis of all this metadata yourself and having to do it either on a completely ad hoc basis or trying to go through reams of PDFs and Excel spreadsheets that your management consultants helpfully put together for you, you can actually, it's automating that analysis for you, which helps you with this scale out problem, which can help you massively reduce the effort involved if you do happen to get 50 disgruntled people asking you questions at the same time. So just a very quick summary, because I think I'm either run out of time or about to run out of time. Start now, please. People, please, start now. You have a year, less than a year. That's one budget cycle if you're lucky. And it is big and it is complex and it is going to cost a lot of money and it is going to take a lot of time. And I'm sorry, there's no good way around that fact. But if you use the right approaches, you can massively reduce the time and costs involved, as well as actually potentially roll up some other projects at the same time, value projects, which can help you build a better business case for it. And as I say, the solution isn't, I haven't said, but I'm going to say to you, the solution isn't just for GDPR. Hopefully you can get that this ability to query where I have personal data, what it's used for, and so forth can be used for other purposes, such as governance risk compliance or security platform if I want to strengthen my security more independently, or just a general 360 platform, because we all like the word 360. So with that, thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. Does anybody like to start?
So thank you, Christy. Really good. So we're tackling some of these issues, and I agree with you, it's very difficult. And I really like that approach on the end user compute. That's where like if we start greenfield and I just have one database, it will be really easy. But the problem is that you have many years of, sometimes you don't even know what you have.
Yeah.
So you have EUCs with Access, Excel, documents, Word documents, SQL servers, Oracles, you name it, they have it. So what would be there? Because you have to be GDPR compliant on everything, or well, maybe not everything. So what would be the approach to tackle that, especially that technical debt that is hidden all over the place and you don't know what to do with it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. One approach, and we had a customer recently who were going to embark on this unless they could come up with something better, is, for example, with all these Excel spreadsheets, if we're not sure, the legal counsel just said, delete it. My job's on the line here, and frankly, so is the company, just delete it. If you can't prove it, delete it. That's one option. Another option is, so as I said, MarkLogic itself, if you can get that data into MarkLogic, you can have MarkLogic help you look at the data for you. We're a great discovery platform. We're a great place to look at that data, search across it, run some rules against it. And the thing is because we can encrypt that, one of the objections is, well, yes, but now you're just moving personal data from one place to another. Aren't you just doubling the risk? Well, we're a secure platform. So whilst you're doing this discovery, you aren't actually, putting in an extra point of concern, because you make sure you encrypt it on disk and you restrict the access. And then if necessary, you delete the data once you've done the discovery. So I think that's another option as well. Of course, when you're talking about terabytes and terabytes of data, would you want to load all of that into MarkLogic? Well, MarkLogic can scale up to terabytes and terabytes of data. And for example, I know the sales guys in the room might not want to hear this, but you could use Amazon, for example, as a way of quickly scaling up MarkLogic as a discovery platform, doing that analysis and then scaling it back down again. But to be honest as well, there's definitely going to be black spots. I think the first place to start is with your own expertise, to go out and ask the organisation, where do you think we need to start? Because practically you're not going to be able to load in every single piece of data everywhere. And I think it becomes a balancing act. I don't have a really good solid answer for you, but there's probably, you may well look at a system and go, it's an old system. It's got a really restricted way into the data. It's used, it's sat in the corner. It's mostly financial data. There might be a bit of personal data in there, but maybe we can come back to that in a few years, sort of thing.
Christine, how many connectors would you have? Would you have at the end ODBC connectors? I'm sure. Would you have, for example, the difficult part would be access and Excel files to actually mine them correctly. I think it's a good idea to have it as a discovery tool.
Right.
So would be a library of plugins, connectors?
Yeah, so we natively can read Excel and Word and so forth. So the key is either pushing data into MarkLogic or MarkLogic can reach out to data. So if it's on a file share, if you give us the appropriate credentials to access the files, we can just load that data in. And again, we're just looking for hints of personal data. We don't have to format it and get a nice semantic model out of it and all of this great stuff that we can do with it. We're just saying, pull the data in. Can we see anything that looks like personal data? Bear in mind, we don't really have to achieve 100% perfection here. As long as we can prove to a regulator that we went through this exercise and we did best approach analysis, that's probably good enough. It's good enough to say we did our best. No one is going to say you have to be 100% perfect. So as long as you can document you did this exercise, that might be okay.
Anybody got anything else? Any arms raised? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for a great presentation. Please remember to fill out your feedback forms that are in your application.